All right, welcome back for part two. So let's talk about domestic policy during the 1960s. Nearly every liberal reformer president in the 20th century had a name for their domestic programs. Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal, FDR had the New Deal, and Truman had the Fair Deal. JFK called his program the New Frontier, and LBJ called his the Great Society. So we're not going to talk a ton about JFK simply because we don't have the time and he had a relatively short presidency. He plays a really big role in the American imagination because he really returned a feeling of youthful energy and optimism to the presidency. But in terms of domestic reforms, he was unable to accomplish many of the goals that he had set out to accomplish. Part of this was due to the fact that he faced really strong opposition from the conservative coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats in Congress, but additionally he found himself preoccupied with the escalating Cold War. And part of it was that he was assassinated halfway through his term on October 22nd, 1963, which is another reason why he looms so large in our national memory. Consequently, much of his New Society legislation failed to become law. He was able to increase the minimum wage, allocate federal funds for public housing projects in poverty-stricken inner-city areas. He founded the Peace Corps. He convinced Congress to allocate $40 billion to the space program that would eventually put an American man on the moon in 1969. But more importantly, when we're talking about domestic reforms during the 60s, is LBJ's Great Society. So in contrast to the wealthy and aristocratic Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson was a true rags to riches story. He had worked his way out of poverty in rural Texas during the Great Depression to become one of the U.S. Senate's most formidable figures. He served as JFK's vice president and took the presidential oath of office on board the place that brought Kennedy's body back to Washington, D.C. from Dallas, where he was shot. He was the first Southerner to serve as president since Woodrow Wilson, but he was not your classic Southern Democrat. Although Johnson was not initially elected as president, he was completely suited for the job. Johnson's outlook was grandiose, to say the least. He wanted to be the greatest American president, the one who did the most good for the most people by creating the most new programs and agencies. He had a genuine concern for the poor and ardently embraced civil rights. Honoring the late president's legacy, Johnson finished many of Kennedy's unrealized goals. He was an incredibly skilled politician and probably pushed legislation through Congress better than any other president in U.S. history. In 1964, the Revenue Act provided a 20% reduction in tax rates. It was intended to give consumers more money to spend so as to boost economic growth and create new jobs, and it worked really well. Unemployment fell from 5.2% in 1964 to 3.8% in 1966. Johnson also pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which Kennedy had proposed, and was stalled in Congress due to opposition from the conservative coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats. Johnson also launched his own unconditional war on poverty. So the war on poverty was inspired by a growing realization and concern for persistent poverty in the U.S. that had been sort of invisible to the American consciousness during the 1950s. This changed when social critic Michael Harrington published a powerful expose called The Other America, in which he revealed that more than 40 million Americans were mired in what he called a culture of poverty. Poverty led to poor housing conditions, which in turn led to problems such as poor health, poor attendance at school or work, alcohol and drug abuse, unwanted pregnancies, and single-parent families. Harrington added that poverty was much more extensive than people realized because much of it was hidden from public view in isolated rural areas or inner-city slums. Johnson vowed to wage a protracted campaign that aspired to fix this problem or to at least lessen it. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was the primary weapon in the war on poverty. It created an Office of Economic Opportunity to administer 11 new community-based programs, many of which still exist today. They include a Job Corps training program for inner-city youth ages 16 to 21, the Head Start educational program for disadvantaged preschoolers, a legal services corporation to provide legal assistance for low-income Americans, financial aid programs for low-income college students, grants to small farmers and rural businesses, loans to businesses that hired the chronically unemployed, the Volunteers in Service to America program to combat inner-city poverty, and the Community Action Program, which would allow the poor a greater level of participation in organizing and directing their own neighborhood programs. In '64, Congress also approved the Food Stamp Act, a program to help poor people afford to buy groceries. As Johnson's war on poverty gathered momentum, his already massive ambitions grew even larger. After his re-election in 1964, Johnson stepped up his agenda of domestic programs that he labeled the Great Society that were intended to end poverty and racial injustice and provide abundance and economic freedom for all Americans. It soon became clear that Johnson viewed the federal government as the magic lever for raising the quality of life for all Americans. He would surpass FDR's New Deal in expanding the goals and scope of the federal government. Johnson's first priorities among his Great Society programs were federal health insurance and aid for young people to pursue higher education. These were liberal proposals that had been first suggested by President Truman in 1945. But for 20 years, the staunch opposition of the American Medical Association had stalled a comprehensive medical insurance program. Now that Johnson and the Democrats had the votes to pass the measure, the American Medical Association joined Republicans in supporting a bill serving those over age 65. The act that finally emerged created not just a Medicare health insurance program for the elderly, but also a Medicaid program of federal grants to states to help cover medical expenses for the poor of all ages. Johnson and the architects of the systems had originally hoped that Medicare and Medicaid would eventually be expanded to cover all Americans, not just the elderly and the poor. A system that we know now as Medicare for All, or universal health care, or single-payer health care, or socialized medicine, or government-run health care. But as we know, this has not happened, and Americans are still fighting for this right today. Also, the Higher Education Act of 1965 increased federal grants to universities, created scholarships for low-income students, and provided low-interest loans for students. The momentum generated by the Higher Education and Medicare Acts helped carry 435 more Great Society bills through Congress, addressing programs to assist in the development of rural areas, to build housing and fund urban renewal projects in inner-city ghettos, and rent assistance to low-income families. Included in this flurry of legislation was the Immigration and Nationality Services Act of 1965. This act abolished the discriminatory annual quotas based on an immigrant's national origin that had been set up in the 1920s and which we talked about a few lectures ago. So it treated all nationalities and races equal. In place of quotas, it created hemispheric ceilings on visas issued. 170,000 for persons from outside the Western Hemisphere and 120,000 for persons from within it, and it also stipulated that no more than 20,000 people could come from any one country each year. The Great Society also included the Voting Rights Act of 1965, among other civil rights legislation that we've already covered. In implementing the many different Great Society programs, LBJ had implemented many social reform programs that had been pushed since the beginning of the 20th century. And this is why the Great Society is viewed as the high point of American liberalism. But the Great Society and the war on poverty never lived up to Johnson's grandiose goals, in part because the Vietnam War soon took priority and siphoned away funding, and in part because neither Johnson nor his congressional supporters quite understood the stubborn complexity of chronic poverty. In many respects, the Great Society generated its own downfalls by inspiring